Snow drifted from the bruised evening sky in slow, pensive flakes, the kind that seemed to fall with memories trapped inside them, as if each white petal carried the silence of someone long forgotten. The wind threaded through the ponderosa pines like a restless spirit, making the branches creak under the weight of winter's grief. Every sound was softened, swallowed, turned tender against the vastness of the cold. Footsteps crunched in the powder, hesitant and uneven, the rhythm of bodies pushed beyond exhaustion yet refusing to surrender. The land stretched out in muted whites and tired grays, an endless sheet folded by the Creator's weary hands. Nothing moved except a widowed woman and the two young daughters she pulled close, like treasures she feared the night might steal. Marigold Ashbury's breath escaped in little tremors, each one visible in the dimming light, fragile as hope itself. Her long golden hair, once polished into elegant waves by servants who whispered behind her back, now hung in frozen ribbons past her cheeks, stiff with frost and tangled by the wind. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. Too rich, they had always said. Too fine for frontier life. Too pretty to be trusted. But wealth had not bought her kindness when she needed it. Money had not shielded her from judgment. Beauty had not earned her mercy. Now she trudged through the wilderness, feeling both stripped and strangely cleansed, as if the snow fell not only around her but through her. Rosalie walked at her right, tall for 12 yet still delicate, her dark lashes dusted with frost and her mouth pinched tight against the cold. Juniper clung to her mother's left arm, smaller, rounder, 11 years old and trembling. Their boots sank deeply into the drifts. They had walked since morning, chased by whispers from Dustmere that clung to their minds like smoke that couldn't be washed from their clothes. They had been cast out before they even understood why. Some women said Marigold was cursed. Some men said she was deceitful. A few claimed she brought ruin wherever she went. Yet not one accusation had carried evidence, only envy and the satisfaction of seeing a polished thing break. Marigold had begged for shelter, quiet and dignified at first, then frantic, but doors shut like jaws. The preacher's wife had offered a brittle smile as she stood in her warm doorway, fire crackling behind her. "We help the humble, dear. The Lord doesn't reward pride," she had said, her hand sliding the door closed with a finality that carved into Marigold's ribs deeper than hunger or cold. Pride. As if pride were a coat she could simply remove. As if humility were a currency she had miscounted. She would remember that tone when the world grew quiet at night. She would hear those words every time she saw her daughters shake. The three of them moved deeper into the forest. Snow thickened, falling in swirls, dimming the last of the daylight until the land seemed carved from fading memory. Marigold wiped at her cheeks, unsure whether the wetness was melted snow or grief. Somewhere behind her ribs something hardened, a quiet, determined ache. She would not let Dustmere decide who she was. She would not let shame be the last blanket around her daughter's shoulders. Rosalie tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mama, how much farther?" "Not far," Marigold whispered, though she wasn't certain of anything. She had only been told of a cabin, whispered about by travelers who claimed an Apache giant lived deep in the woods, a man known for solitude and strength. Some called him dangerous. Others said he had lost everyone he loved and chose silence over society. Marigold hadn't cared about the rumors. A roof was a roof even if it belonged to a legend. Juniper stumbled. Marigold bent quickly, steadying her. The girl's lips were blue. Snowflakes clung to her brows. Marigold tightened her grip on both daughters, urging them forward even as her legs trembled like a deer chased too long. She looked up, past the trees, past the snow, and sent a prayer somewhere, anywhere. Not for herself. For them. The forest opened suddenly into a small clearing. Smoke curled from a chimney, rising in thin, wavering lines into the winter sky. A cabin sat tucked beneath the towering pines as if grown there rather than built. Its logs were darkened by weather, its roof burdened with snow, but its windows glowed faintly like two tired eyes that still managed a weary warmth. Marigold exhaled a breath she had been holding since Dustmere. Her knees nearly buckled. A rhythmic sound echoed, chop, split, thud. Chop, split, thud. She turned toward it, heart racing. A man stood near the back of the clearing, illuminated by the pale smear of moonlight rising between the clouds. He swung an axe with slow, controlled power. His body was broad, sculpted by years of labor the land demanded and the world rarely thanked. Even in the freezing air, he wore no shirt. Steam rose from his bronzed skin with every breath, as if he were part of the earth's own heat trying to fight the cold back. His long dark hair was tied loosely at the nape of his neck, braids trailing down his back. Snowflakes kissed his shoulders and melted instantly. His presence dominated the space without effort. Kaya Redhawk. Marigold knew it must be him. No other man could match the stories. He paused mid-swing. His head turned slowly. His gaze found them, not startled, not angry, but deeply alert, like a mountain animal unsure whether the figures before him came with harm or hunger. His eyes, dark and steady, moved from Marigold to Rosalie, then to Juniper. Something shifted subtly in his expression, though whether it was concern or calculation, Marigold couldn't tell. Her throat tightened. Words tangled behind her teeth. She wanted to speak, to beg, to explain, but pride and fear struck her silent. She felt small under his gaze, exposed as if he saw not just their shivering bodies but the scars of judgment etched beneath their clothes. Rosalie pressed closer. Juniper hid behind her sleeve. Kyle lowered the axe. He didn't approach at first. He simply watched, measuring the snow-heavy air, the danger of strangers, the tremble in three exhausted bodies. His silence was unsettling not because it felt hostile but because it felt ancient, older than secrets, older than sorrow. Marigold opened her mouth again, but before sound could form, her vision blurred. Her legs gave out. Snow rushed up to meet her. The world tilted, spun, then steadied only when a pair of powerful arms slipped beneath her. His hands were warm, shockingly warm, and impossibly gentle. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child. The breath she had been clinging to left her in a gasp. Kaya's scent filled her lungs, juniper smoke, pine resin, and something raw, elemental, like clean earth after rain. Her head lolled against his shoulder. She hated how helpless she felt. Hated how she leaned instinctively toward warmth like a creature born in winter. Her daughters cried out, but Kaya only shifted Marigold in his arms to keep her steady and nodded for the girls to follow. No words. No questions. Just a silent command wrapped in unexpected mercy. He stepped toward the cabin with long strides, snow crunching beneath his feet. Rosalie and Juniper hurried behind, glancing back at the dark forest, half expecting riders from Dustmere to burst through the trees. The cabin door creaked as Kaya pushed it open with his boot. Warmth washed over them like a blessing. The interior glowed with amber light from a fire crackling in a stone hearth. The room smelled of juniper smoke and the faint sweetness of dried berries. Navajo rugs softened the wooden floor. Pelts hung on the walls, arranged not as trophies but as layers of comfort. A pot simmered over the flames, steam curling lazily upward. Kaya lowered Marigold gently onto a buffalo hide bed, placing a thick woven blanket over her. Rosalie and Juniper rushed to her side, shaking from relief and shock. Marigold blinked up at them, then at the towering figure who now stood a few steps back, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. He looked like a guardian carved from quiet storm. Her voice emerged in a whisper. "Thank you." Kaya didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was its own language. The girls huddled against their mother, but their eyes kept flicking to the Apache warrior whose presence filled the small cabin like an untamed wind. Marigold studied him through half-lidded eyes. She had expected danger. She had expected coldness. She had expected the harsh indifference of a man who owed her nothing. Instead, she found a strange, steady calm radiating from him, an unexpected stillness that soothed the parts of her that had been trembling since the town turned its back. But that same stillness carried power. She could feel it like a quiet pulse in the room. Outside, the wind howled again, sweeping across the cabin walls. The snow thickened. The cold pressed hard against the world. But inside, something shifted between Marigold Ashbury and Kaya Redhawk, something delicate and unnamed, rising from the embers of fear and the weight of everything lost. And as the storm deepened outside the cabin, another sound whispered through the night, the distant echo of hooves moving through snow, drawing closer with every passing heartbeat. Warmth wrapped itself around Marigold like a fragile blessing she feared would vanish if she breathed too deeply. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow turning the room into a sanctuary carved out of amber and shadow. The scent of juniper smoke drifted through the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of rabbit stew simmering above the flames. Snow still whispered against the cabin walls, but inside, the world softened, its sharp edges dulled by flickering light and the steady rhythm of heat. Marigold lay on the buffalo hide bed, the heavy woven blanket pulled to her chin, trying to make sense of the gentleness she had been shown. Kindness had become a rare language, one she no longer trusted herself to speak. Rosalie and Juniper sat close beside her, their small hands tucked into her sleeves as if afraid she might disappear. Their cheeks were flushed from warmth now, no longer the pale blue of fear. Rosalie glanced toward the fire, watching Kaya Redhawk kneel over the pot of stew with the quiet precision of a man used to caring for himself and expecting no one to thank him for it. His movements were deliberate, measured, as though everything he touched required respect. The girls whispered to each other about how strong he looked, how tall, how he didn't seem bothered by the cold despite the snow melting on his bare shoulders. Marigold shifted, her limbs heavy but her eyes alert. She studied Kaya in the firelight. There was a gravity to him, an aura of a man who had outlived more winters than he cared to count. She wondered how long he had lived alone in these woods, how many storms had passed through his life, how many people had come to his door only to leave again. His silence seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains, but there was nothing cruel in it. It was simply the silence of a man who had learned to carry himself without leaning on others. He ladled the stew into wooden bowls, filling them with tender meat and broth rich with herbs. Without a word, he handed the first bowl to Rosalie, then the second to Juniper. Only after their small hands curled around the warm wood did he pour a serving for Marigold. She reached out, her fingers trembling, not sure if the shaking came from hunger or shame. He held the bowl steady until she had a grip on it, and their eyes met for the briefest breath. Something in her chest tightened. There was no accusation in his gaze, no pity, only a quiet acknowledgement of what she had endured. She murmured a thank you. Kaya simply nodded once and returned to preparing his own meal. Rosalie tasted her stew and let out a soft gasp of relief. Juniper smiled for the first time since leaving Dustmere. Marigold watched her girls eat with trembling gratitude, feeling as though the warmth of the stew seeped directly into the fractures of her heart. She forced herself to take small sips, savoring each mouthful. It had been so long since anything had tasted like real comfort. Kaya finally sat near the fire, turning the wooden bowl in his hands before taking slow, thoughtful bites. The girls kept sneaking glances at him. Marigold could sense their curiosity, the mixture of fear and wonder children feel around someone who seems larger than life. But Kaya did not invade their space. He seemed to shrink his presence, as if trying not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the room. After a while, the firelight softened the hard planes of his face. Marigold dared to speak. "We didn't mean to intrude. We were just lost." Kaya didn't look up. "Storm would have taken you." His voice was deep, low, carrying the weight of simple truth rather than dramatics. Marigold swallowed, humbled. She had expected a lecture or suspicion or worse, a refusal to let them stay. But he offered the statement with matter-of-fact certainty, as though saving them had been as instinctive to him as breathing. Juniper shifted closer to the fire. "Sir, are you alone out here?" Kaya paused, gaze shifting to the child. "Yes." The answer was a stone dropped into a still pond, simple but echoing. Rosalie and Juniper exchanged looks. Marigold felt something tug at her chest, pity or recognition, she wasn't sure. Loneliness had a way of recognizing its own reflection. The fire crackled again, sparks drifting upward like tiny stars searching for a sky. Marigold took a deeper breath. "Thank you for letting us stay. We had nowhere else." Kaya's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He set down his empty bowl and finally looked at her fully. His eyes were dark, not unkind but full of caution, as if he weighed every word he might speak. "Town sent you away." It wasn't a question. It was a truth he had already pieced together. The shame she carried made its home in the hollow of her stomach. She looked down at her half-empty bowl, unable to meet his eyes. "They didn't believe me," she whispered. "About my husband. About the debts he left behind. About what I didn't know. They said I brought trouble with me. They said, too much." Her voice cracked before she could gather it back. Rosalie leaned into her. Kaya watched them silently, the fire casting shadows along his features. "Town talks too much," he said finally. "Listens too little." A quiet hush filled the room, as if something sacred had been spoken. His words were simple, but they unlocked something inside Marigold. For so long she had been drowning beneath those whispers. Hearing them dismissed so easily by a man who owed her nothing felt like a warm cloth pressed to a long-neglected wound. She covered her face with one hand, fighting tears. Rosalie held her tighter. Juniper moved closer, wrapping an arm around her waist. Kaya stood, walked to a corner of the room, and pulled down a thick, fur-lined shawl made from soft deerskin. Without ceremony, he draped it around Marigold's shoulders. His hands lingered only long enough to ensure it wouldn't slip. Marigold's breath caught again, this time from something gentler than shock. She traced the edge of the shawl with trembling fingers. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You're cold," Kaya replied simply. "Take it." The firmness in his voice allowed no argument. Her throat tightened. She nodded, clutching the shawl around herself. Her daughters looked at Kaya with wary gratitude, as if trying to understand the kind of man who helped without asking for anything in return. Kaya returned to the fire and added another log. The flames rose, throwing warmth across the cabin. Marigold felt her muscles loosen one by one, the fear inside her unwinding slowly. She had not realized how long she had been holding herself rigid, bracing for unkindness. When the girls finished eating, they helped clear the bowls instinctively, as though the simple task brought a sense of belonging. Kaya didn't tell them to stop, but he watched with a faint softening in his eyes. Snow pressed against the windows. The world outside had lost its shape to white. Hours passed gently. Marigold began to feel the pull of sleep, her eyelids drooping despite her efforts. She forced them open when she saw Kaya stepping outside, his axe resting against his shoulder. Panic flickered in her chest, some old instinct telling her that safety was temporary, that danger would return if her protector stepped too far. But he only went to split more firewood under the moonlight, his body moving with a steady rhythm, each strike echoing through the quiet night. Juniper whispered, "Mama, he's not scary at all." Marigold smoothed her daughter's hair. "No, sweetheart. I don't think he ever was." But her words carried a tremor. Because there was something about Kaya Redhawk, a quiet strength that unsettled her, not with fear but with the realization that he could see through the walls she had built to survive. Later, when he stepped back inside, brushing snow from his braids, Marigold watched him from the bed. The fire reflected in his eyes. Their gazes met again. This time neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, something cautious, fragile, and alive. The cabin felt smaller with him inside. Not in a threatening way, but in the way a room feels smaller when two people begin to notice each other with a new understanding. The storm growled outside, but inside, warmth slowly threaded itself through the cracks of their fear. Marigold's voice was faint when she spoke. "Kaya, do you think the men from town will come this far?" Kaya didn't answer immediately. He sat near the fire, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His silence stretched, thick and contemplative. Finally he said, "Depends what they think you're worth." The words hit her with an unexpected ache. She swallowed hard. "And what do you think I'm worth?" Kaya lifted his head. His gaze locked with hers. For a heartbeat, the room felt suspended. Even the fire seemed to quiet. "You and your girls," he said slowly, "are worth enough that no storm should take you. And no man should either." A shiver rippled through her, not from cold. Before she could respond, before she could gather her conflicted heart into words, a sound outside sliced through the warm hush. The low, unmistakable groan of fresh snow being crushed beneath heavy boots. Kaya's eyes shifted toward the door. He set the fire poker down and reached for his axe. Morning arrived gently, as if it were afraid to disturb the fragile quiet that had settled inside the cabin overnight. Pale gold light seeped through the frost-laced window, warming the wooden floorboards and casting slow-moving shadows that stretched like waking animals across the pelts. The fire had dimmed to a soft glow, but its heat still lingered, wrapping the room in a cocoon of comfort. Rosalie stirred first, blinking against the morning brightness, and Juniper soon followed with a yawn that sounded more like a sigh of relief than tiredness. Marigold lay between them, feeling the weight of her daughters' bodies pressed close, their breaths steady and warm against her skin. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, she felt a thin ribbon of safety coiling gently through her chest. Kaya was already awake. He sat by the hearth, feeding pieces of dry juniper into the fading fire. His movements were unhurried, almost meditative, the deliberate motions of a man who found solace in simple tasks. Morning light slipped across his shoulders, revealing faint scars etched along his skin like stories written without ink. Marigold watched him quietly, unsure if he knew she was awake. His presence filled the room with a grounded calm that steadied her heart more effectively than any words could. She wondered who had taught him such gentleness, and what kind of sorrow had carved the silence he carried so carefully. The girls rose from the bed, walking shyly toward him. Kaya shifted slightly to give them space, though he didn't stop tending the fire. Rosalie pointed at the stone mortar and pestle on a low table beside him. "What's that for?" she asked softly. "Corn," Kaya replied without looking up. "You grind it to make bread." Juniper stepped closer, curiosity overtaking her fear. "Can we try?" Kaya paused, then gestured for them to come nearer. He showed them how to hold the pestle, how to press it down and roll it in small circles. The girls watched him carefully and then attempted the motion themselves. Their effort was clumsy at first, but Kaya didn't correct them harshly. Instead, he guided their hands with the lightest touch, offering silent encouragement. Marigold watched from the bed, something tender stirring beneath her ribs at the sight of her children engaged in simple work that made them laugh softly before they caught themselves, as if joy still felt like forbidden territory. When the girls were occupied, Marigold walked toward Kaya, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She hesitated before kneeling beside him, unsure if she was intruding. He turned his gaze to her, and she felt pinned in place by the depth of his eyes. Not judgment. Not suspicion. Something older. Something that understood wounds without needing explanations. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still rough with sleep. "For everything. For helping them feel safe." Kaya looked back at the fire. Children shouldn't fear the morning. The simplicity of his words struck her harder than any sermon she had heard in Dustmere. Her breath wavered. She lowered her gaze, tracing her fingers along the edge of the shawl he had given her the night before. Courage, fragile but insistent, settled in her chest like a small flame. "Last night," she began slowly, "when you said the storm would have taken us, you were right." Her throat tightened. "But the town would have too." Kaya didn't shift, didn't interrupt. His stillness was permission. Marigold exhaled shakily. "My husband, he left me with debts I didn't know existed. Land he claimed wasn't really ours. Money he borrowed under false promises. When he died, everything became mine, every lie, every debt, every angry man demanding repayment." Her hand trembled. She clasped it with the other. "They said I must have known. That a woman like me couldn't possibly be innocent. They said I was hiding money. That I deserved whatever came." Kaya's brow furrowed slightly, though his voice remained soft. "You didn't run." "No," she whispered. "But they pushed me out anyway." She swallowed. "And I believed them. I believed I deserved it. That their cruelty was the truth I had earned." Kaya finally turned to face her fully. "People fear what they don't understand. They punish what they envy." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected the words to feel so accurate, so unfiltered. He looked at her with calm certainty that made her want to cry. No one in Dustmere had ever seen her as anything other than a problem wearing a lovely face. Kaya saw her as something else entirely, something human, flawed, hurting, and worthy of space. The girls laughed quietly behind them as Juniper managed to grind the corn without spilling it. Kaya's eyes softened at the sound. Marigold watched him, feeling her fear loosen another knot inside her chest. Later, as the stew reheated over the fire, Kaya led her outside to gather snow for water. The storm had softened overnight, leaving the forest blanketed in powdery white that sparkled under the pale sun. The air was crisp, each breath forming clouds that drifted upward like freed spirits. Marigold inhaled deeply, the cold air clearing her lungs and sharpening her senses. Kaya scooped snow into a metal pot with steady hands. Marigold bent to help, but her fingers froze at the sight of strange tracks near the tree line, hoofprints, deep and fresh, leading toward the cabin. She looked up sharply. "Kaya," she whispered, dread tightening her ribs. "Those weren't there before." He stood beside her, following her gaze. His expression darkened, though he remained impossibly calm. He crouched, touching one of the indentations. The snow around it was lightly disturbed, suggesting the rider had passed through recently, perhaps during the night. "3 horses," Kaya murmured. "Heavy men." They circled the clearing. Watched from the trees. Marigold stepped back, heart pounding. "They were looking for us." Kaya lifted his head, meeting her eyes with steady resolve. "They'll come again." Fear rushed through her like icy water. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She felt the old panic rising, the helplessness she thought she had left behind with Dustmere's closed doors and sharp tongues. Kaya set the pot down and placed a hand near her shoulder, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the intention. "You're not alone now," he said quietly. The words settled in her like warm stones. She nodded, still trembling, and carried the pot back toward the cabin with him. Inside, her daughters were shaping the ground corn into small patties, excited to show her their work. Marigold forced a smile for them, hiding her fear behind the shawl wrapped tightly around her. Kaya cooked the patties on a flat stone near the fire. The girls sat beside him, leaning in to watch. Marigold settled nearby, her knees drawn close, warmth returning slowly to her limbs. Kaya handed each child a warm piece of bread, then one to her. She bit into it, savoring the simple, comforting flavors. It wasn't just food, it was a small piece of normalcy in a world that had taken so much from her. The girls soon drifted to play near the pelts, their laughter rising and falling like soft music. Kaya sat across from Marigold, his gaze thoughtful. She tried to speak but found her voice caught in her throat. He studied her with patience, the silence stretching gently between them. "You carry shame that isn't yours," he said at last. The words pierced her. She closed her eyes, feeling tears gather. "I know," she whispered. "But it feels like mine. It always has." He nodded slowly as if he understood wounds that clung despite truth. She wondered what ghosts he carried, what grief lived behind the calm lines of his face. Afternoon light softened the cabin. The fire crackled. The girls slept curled together. Kaya sat sharpening his knife, the rhythmic rasp of stone against steel strangely soothing. Marigold watched him, feeling the warmth of his presence settle into her bones like something long denied. As dusk crept in, she stepped outside for air. The forest glowed with the last hues of day, blue shadows stretching across the snow. Kaya followed quietly, standing beside her without speaking. They watched the sky change, two solitary souls learning the shape of shared silence. Marigold hugged the shawl around her. "Do you think they'll come soon?" Kaya looked toward the darkening woods. "Yes." Her heart fluttered painfully. She met his eyes, seeking something: assurance, courage, maybe forgiveness. "What will you do?" she whispered. He turned to her with calm finality. "Whatever it takes." His words were a promise, heavy and undeniable. She felt a spark of courage ignite inside her, small but fiercely warm. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, a distant voice called out her name. The forest swallowed the voice almost as soon as it slipped between the trees, but Marigold heard it clearly enough to freeze her breath mid-exhale. Her name echoed again, distant and drawn out, like a warning carried on the wind by someone who wished to haunt her. Snow trembled from the branches overhead. Kaya stood beside her with the stillness of a statue carved from patience and experience, though his eyes sharpened with a hunter's instinct. The sky had darkened to a deep bruised blue, and the thin light of dusk settled over the cabin like a fragile veil. Marigold felt the instinct to run surge up her spine, the old fear of being dragged back into a life shaped by other people's cruelty, but Kaya's presence anchored her, steady as the earth beneath her feet. She drew a breath that tasted of cold resin and dread. Kaya tilted his head, listening, his braids shifting with a faint breeze. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravel-low and measured, as though shaped directly from the tension in the air. "They're close." Marigold swallowed, her pulse fluttering in her throat, but she didn't retreat into the cabin. Instead, she stepped nearer to him, her shawl clutched tight around her as if it held the courage she needed to borrow. The last ribbons of daylight caught against the scars on Kaya's shoulders, and she realized those scars weren't signs of violence alone. They were proof that he had survived people who once came with cold hearts and warmer guns. She wondered if he saw her in the same way, someone shaped not by wealth or reputation but by survival. Another voice rose in the distance, harsher, angrier, slashing through the forest shadows. The men from Dustmere were not trying to hide. Juniper appeared at the doorway, her small face pale beneath the glow of the firelight. "Mama?" she whispered. Rosalie followed, gripping her sister's hand, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that made childhood slip too quickly into adulthood. Marigold turned toward them, her instinct to protect almost pulling her forward, but Kaya moved first, stepping between them and the darkening forest without needing instruction. He lowered his axe from his shoulder, holding it casually, as though it were a familiar extension of his arm rather than a weapon. "Inside," he said softly. The girls obeyed, but Marigold remained where she was. Kaya looked at her for a long moment, his gaze holding hers with quiet understanding. "You don't need to face them alone." The word struck a place she had kept locked since the moment Dustmere turned her into something monstrous in its eyes. She nodded once, sharp and certain. The first rider emerged from the trees with a snort of his horse and a curse under his breath. Snow shuddered beneath hooves as two more followed. Their coats were heavy with frost, their hats pulled low, but Marigold recognized the shape of their cruelty even before their faces came into view. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a dark mustache and eyes like oil, leaned forward on his saddle and spat into the snow. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, his gaze landing on Marigold. "You really did run all the way out here." His voice was coated in mockery, but beneath it lay ownership, the kind of ownership that had fueled whispers, lies, and closed doors. Marigold felt her stomach churn, but she didn't step back. She held her ground, though her fingers trembled beneath the shawl Kaya had given her. Another rider, gaunt and sharp-jawed, pulled his reins so abruptly that his horse reared. "Town says you got money hidden away," he snapped. And we aim to collect what's owed. Marigold's breath hitched. The accusation was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability, but here in the quiet sanctuary of Kaya's clearing, it sounded ridiculous, like a broken song played out of tune. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kaya stepped forward before she could speak. He didn't raise his axe. He didn't threaten. He simply planted his boots in the snow and looked directly at the men with the steady calm of a storm deciding where to strike. "There's no debt here," he said. The mustached rider laughed, the sound splintering across the clearing. "Ain't talking to you, Apache." Kaya remained still, unfazed, and Marigold saw something shift in the air, as if the forest itself braced for whatever would come next. Marigold stepped beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact steadied her. She lifted her chin, letting the snowfall kiss her cheeks. "Dustmere cast us out," she said. "You shut your doors. You shut your hearts. You made it clear we owed you nothing." Her voice trembled but didn't break. The gaunt man sneered. "You stole from your husband's creditors." Marigold shook her head slowly. "I inherited shame, not money." The lead rider narrowed his eyes, studying her as though searching for weakness. "You're coming with us, whether you admit it or not." Kaya took one step forward, only one, but the impact was immediate. The horses shuffled backward. The riders stiffened. Kaya's voice cut through the cold like a blade. "No one takes them." Silence spread, thick and electric. The mustached man placed a hand on his revolver. Marigold felt her breath catch, but Kaya didn't move toward violence. Instead, he turned his head just enough to speak to her without taking his eyes off the threat. "Stay behind me." But she didn't. She took another step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the snow. The riders blinked, startled. Marigold felt something powerful rising from the ashes of her fear, anger, dignity, a will she had buried under years of trying to be polite and pleasing. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice low but fierce. "My daughters aren't going back. You don't get to decide our worth." Kaya's jaw tightened, and the faintest shadow of pride flickered in his expression. The lead rider swore under his breath and drew his gun. The world seemed to hold its breath. Snowflakes paused midair. Marigold saw Juniper's face appear at the window behind them, her eyes wide and terrified. Something inside Marigold snapped. She stepped fully in front of Kaya before she realized she'd moved. The gun clicked, metal cold and final. Kaya lunged, not with violence but with precision, his hand sweeping up a handful of snow and flinging it into the gunman's face. The horse jerked. The rider cursed, blinded, and Kaya's axe slammed into the ground at the horse's feet with a force that rattled the clearing. Not killing. Not attacking. A warning carved from mercy and power. The other riders faltered. The air shifted again. The gaunt man tugged his reins in retreat. The mustached rider wiped his eyes, his bravado draining away like water through cracked wood. The forest thundered with silence as they realized this fight couldn't be won. Not with weapons, not with threats, not with shame. One by one the horses turned. Snow churned beneath hooves as the men retreated into the darkness between the pines, their pride trailing behind them like torn fabric. When they were gone, Marigold's knees buckled. Kaya caught her before she fell, his hands warm and firm on her arms. She didn't cry, not yet, but she felt the tremor of relief break open inside her. Kaya studied her face with a look that held no ownership, no pity, only quiet understanding. "It's over for tonight," he murmured. She nodded, unable to speak. Rosalie and Juniper rushed outside and flung their arms around her. Marigold pulled them close, her breath shuddering with the force of held-back emotion. Kaya stepped away, giving them space, though his presence still anchored the air around them. The snow began to fall in softer flakes now, drifting gently as though the storm itself had decided to rest. When the girls were finally asleep inside the cabin, Marigold stood near the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she warmed them. Kaya approached, though he kept a respectful distance. The glow of the flames painted gold along his cheekbones. Marigold turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to help us." Kaya's eyes softened. "Shelter is not something people earn," he said. "It's something we choose to give." Her breath caught. She felt the truth of his words settle deep, like a seed planted in thawing soil. For the first time in her life she felt the fragile beginnings of belonging, real belonging, not the shallow acceptance Dustmere offered only when convenience demanded it. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the snow continued its slow descent. Marigold stepped closer, her voice thin with honesty. "I don't know what comes next." Kaya looked at her with steady certainty. "Then we face it when it comes." She nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They stood there together in the quiet, watching the flames dance, letting the silence carve a new kind of comfort between them. She thought of the clearing, the riders, the fear that had once ruled her life. And she realized something she had never dared admit before. She was no longer running. She was choosing. A soft knock rattled the door. Marigold froze. Kaya's hand hovered near his axe. And from outside, a familiar woman's voice whispered through the wood, quivering, desperate, and unexpected. "Marigold, please. Let me in."